The day had started like any other, with sunlight streaming softly through the bedroom blinds, casting golden streaks across the walls. I lay there for a few moments, tracing the familiar patterns of light, trying to ignore the hollow ache that had been growing inside me for months. My husband, Michael, was already gone, the quiet click of the front door marking his early departure. I should have felt content, safe in the rhythm of our life, but instead, I felt a gnawing emptiness. The house was too quiet, the walls too close, and the silence pressed on me like a weight I couldn't lift. We had been married for 8 years, and somewhere along the way, the conversations had stopped flowing. The laughter had faded into polite smiles, and intimacy had become transactional, mechanical, almost non-existent. Michael wasn't cruel or neglectful. He wasn't someone who raised his voice or left me to fend for myself, but he was distant. Emotionally, he was somewhere far away, and the harder I tried to reach him, the more I felt like I was drowning in a fog that neither of us could navigate together. I didn't realize how desperate I had become for connection until the crisis happened. It started as a small, mundane accident. I had been rearranging the kitchen cabinets, a simple task, really, but the ladder wobbled under my weight, and before I knew it, I was sprawled across the floor, a sharp pain shooting up my ankle. Panic set in, my breath quickened, and I tried to call Michael, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I sat there on the cold tiles, the dull ache in my ankle mingling with the sharper ache of loneliness, realizing, in that instant, how truly isolated I had become. The sound of the front door opening startled me, and before I could cry out, a voice called gently, "Are you okay?" I turned to see him, Ryan the firefighter. He had been called to check the smoke detector in our building, a routine safety check, and had noticed the commotion. He moved with the kind of calm assurance that seemed almost impossible in the chaos of my panic. Kneeling beside me, his voice soft yet commanding, he guided me through breathing exercises, talked me through each movement so I wouldn't aggravate the pain, and offered a steadying hand that anchored me to reality. I remember thinking, almost ungratefully, how easy it felt to trust him. His presence was reassuring in a way Michael's hadn't been for years. Ryan's eyes held patience, warmth, and genuine concern not just for the immediate danger, but for me as a person. There was no judgment in his gaze, no expectation, only care. I felt tears prickle at the corners of my eyes, but I swallowed them, ashamed of how relieved I was that a stranger could make me feel safe when my husband seemed incapable of doing so. Over the next few minutes, he helped me to the couch, elevated my ankle, and instructed me on how to manage the swelling. He stayed, despite the urgency of his duties, chatting lightly, making small jokes that drew reluctant laughter from me. For the first time in months, I felt seen, understood, and acknowledged. The walls of my loneliness began to crack, and I realized, with a mix of guilt and relief, that I was craving more of this attention than I had any right to. When he finally left, I found myself staring at the door long after it closed, replaying every moment, every word, every subtle gesture. The guilt washed over me almost immediately. This was wrong, I told myself. He was just doing his job, and I was married. Yet the warmth that lingered in my chest refused to dissipate. I could not shake the feeling of safety and comfort that Ryan had provided, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness that had become the norm in my home. That night, as I lay in bed beside Michael, listening to his even breathing, I realized something unsettling. My mind kept drifting to Ryan's calm demeanor, his reassuring words, the way his hand had steadied mine. I felt a confusing mix of gratitude, longing, and guilt. I wasn't in love with him, not yet, but I was aware, painfully aware, of the emotional chasm that had formed between my husband and me. And in that realization, I understood something I hadn't admitted to myself before. I was dangerously close to finding solace in someone else, someone who wasn't supposed to exist in the intimate corners of my life. It was only the beginning. The first crack had formed, a fissure wide enough to let new feelings seep in, feelings I wasn't ready to confront. And as I drifted into a restless sleep that night, I knew the comfort I had felt from Ryan would haunt me, lingering in the quiet moments, whispering of a connection I had long forgotten was possible. The storm had not yet broken, but the first gusts were already stirring. The following days were a blur of small, almost imperceptible shifts that began to erode the life I had known. Every morning, I woke with a quiet dread, anticipating the same emptiness that had become the backdrop of my existence. Michael was present physically. Of course, he kissed me lightly before leaving, asked about dinner plans, went through the motions, but it was hollow. His eyes rarely met mine with warmth anymore, and our conversations were filled with surface-level niceties that barely skimmed the depth of the life we were supposed to be sharing. I found myself thinking about Ryan constantly, not in a way that was overtly romantic, at least not yet, but in the way one might fixate on a lifeline when drowning. His presence had been comforting, grounding, the kind of anchor I hadn't realized I was desperate for. My thoughts drifted back to the way he had knelt beside me on that cold kitchen floor, the gentle firmness in his voice as he instructed me to breathe, to relax, to let go of the panic clawing at my chest. I craved that reassurance. I craved someone who could see me, really see me, and I hated myself for it. It started innocently enough, texting him to thank him for his help, a small message of gratitude that felt harmless. "I can't tell you how much your help meant the other day. I didn't realize how panicked I was until you were there. Thank you." I sent it quickly, heart hammering, and immediately felt a rush of relief as he replied almost instantly. His response was polite, professional, but warm. "You're welcome. I'm glad you're okay. If you need advice on your ankle or anything else, don't hesitate to ask." I stared at his words longer than I should have, my pulse quickening in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. It was an exchange so simple, so innocent, yet it ignited a spark in me that I couldn't ignore. Every follow-up message became a thread I clung to, a lifeline to an emotional connection that my marriage had long denied me. And every time Michael came home, the contrast was unbearable. He would recount his day, mundane office meetings, and small frustrations, and I would smile politely, nod along, but my mind would wander to Ryan, to the calm steadiness of his presence, to the small gestures of care that had touched something deep inside me. I began to notice subtle changes in Michael's behavior too. Not drastic, not alarming, but enough to feel like a confirmation of the distance that had grown between us. He was impatient when I asked for help around the house, distracted when I tried to discuss feelings or plans, and increasingly quick to retreat into the solace of television or his phone rather than engage. Each interaction left me feeling smaller, more isolated, more invisible. It was painful, yes, but it also made me desperate for the one person who seemed to notice me, who seemed to care in a way that Michael no longer did. Then came the night of the storm. A sudden thunderstorm had rolled in unexpectedly, the wind thrashing against the windows, the rain pounding in relentless sheets. Michael was away on a business trip, leaving me alone with the sound of the storm battering the house. I sat on the couch, ankles swollen and throbbing, heart racing with both fear and the gnawing loneliness that had become my constant companion. Without thinking, I reached for my phone and sent a text to Ryan. "I know it's late, but the storm is frightening me. Can you?" I paused, fingers hovering, then pressed send. I almost immediately regretted it. I wasn't supposed to lean on him like this, especially not in the absence of my husband. Yet within moments, his reply appeared. "I'm here. Talk to me. Stay calm. Take deep breaths." And just like that, he guided me through the storm, from miles away. His words were a balm, soothing the tension in my chest, easing the fear that had clawed at me relentlessly. I could feel my body relaxing, my mind clearing, as if his presence, even through a screen, had a tangible weight that grounded me. By the time the storm had passed, I felt drained, but oddly invigorated, filled with a strange mixture of guilt and longing. I knew I was treading a dangerous line, but the need for comfort, for recognition, for emotional connection had become too strong to ignore. That night, I lay in bed with my thoughts consumed by Ryan's calm voice and the feeling of safety he provided. I realized, with an almost sickening clarity, that my emotional dependency on him was growing, and that dependency was beginning to overshadow my marriage. The next morning, I avoided Michael's gaze at breakfast, focusing instead on the lingering warmth that Ryan's support had left behind. I could feel the cracks widening, small but significant, and I knew that once these fissures opened fully, there would be no going back. The lines between gratitude, emotional reliance, and forbidden desire were blurring, and I feared the consequences before I even knew how far this path would take me. The days that followed the storm marked a subtle, yet undeniable shift in my reality. I found myself thinking about Ryan more often than I should, letting my mind wander to him during mundane moments, waiting in line at the grocery store, stirring the coffee in the morning, even while folding laundry. Each thought was accompanied by a jolt of guilt, a pang of longing that reminded me of how far I had drifted from Michael. I tried to push it away, tried to anchor myself in the life I had built, but it was like trying to hold back a river with my bare hands. One evening, Michael had returned from his trip earlier than expected. I should have felt relief, joy, the comfort of his presence, but instead, I felt a sense of tension knotting in my chest. His arrival was punctuated by hurried goodnights to the kids and half-hearted exchanges about his travels. Dinner was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in, making the air feel heavy. I laughed at his attempts at humor, but the sound felt forced, hollow. Meanwhile, my mind replayed Ryan's calm guidance during the storm, the gentle concern in his messages, the way he had made me feel safe and seen. It was a dangerous craving, this emotional connection, and I began seeking opportunities to interact with Ryan beyond mere emergency guidance. I found excuses to text him, asking for advice about minor accidents with the kids or questions about basic safety tips. Each exchange was innocent enough on the surface, yet beneath the words, I felt a warmth, a closeness, that Michael no longer provided. Ryan replied with patience, concern, and sometimes humor, a stark contrast to the coldness that had slowly seeped into my marriage. Then came the first face-to-face encounter since the incident in my kitchen. Ryan had been assigned to conduct a routine inspection at my neighborhood, and I knew he would be coming past my house. My heart pounded as I opened the door, trying to mask the anxiety, the anticipation, the thrill that coursed through me. When he stepped onto my porch, helmet in hand, uniform slightly rumpled, and that familiar calm in his eyes, I realized just how deeply I had begun to rely on him, not just for safety, but for the emotional sustenance that had been absent for far too long. Our conversation started professionally, awkwardly even, discussing protocols and neighborhood safety. But gradually, it slipped into the personal. He asked about my recovery, how I had slept through the storm, and about Michael. Each question, each small gesture, felt intimate in a way that made my stomach flutter. I laughed at myself for noticing the subtle crease of concern between his brows, the way his hand brushed against mine when showing me a safety device. It was electric, and I hated myself for feeling it. That night, alone in my bedroom, I replayed every moment of our interaction. I knew Michael would never understand, never see me in the way Ryan did, and yet, the guilt gnawed at me, reminding me that this emotional dependency was walking a tightrope. One misstep could destroy everything. I tried to refocus on my marriage, to remind myself of the vows, the shared life, the history, but the truth was unavoidable. I was no longer present in my own life. My thoughts, my longing, my attention, all were directed toward someone who was not my husband. It wasn't just emotional anymore. I began noticing the way Ryan's presence made me physically react. A brush of his hand, a shared laugh, even the way he spoke my name. It sent shivers down my spine. I felt torn between the comfort he provided and the love I once had for Michael, a love that now felt like a distant memory. Every glance, every word, became a temptation I fought to suppress. And the more I tried to resist, the more I realized how much I had already crossed an invisible line. Then came the text that changed everything. Ryan wrote, "I've been thinking about you since the storm. I hope you're okay. Call me when you can." My heart skipped several beats. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, unsure whether to answer. The rational part of me screamed that this was dangerous, that the emotional attachment I had cultivated could spiral into something irreversible. And yet, the loneliness, the hunger for attention, for validation, for someone to truly see me, overpowered caution. I dialed his number. Our conversation was long, unbroken, intimate. He asked about my day, my thoughts, my fears. He listened with patience, the kind that made me want to pour my soul out. I confessed fears I had never shared with Michael, fears about my own inadequacy, my anxiety, my worry about failing as a wife and mother. And Ryan listened. He didn't judge, didn't offer cliches. He just heard me, and in his presence, even through a phone call, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. By the time we hung up, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. I knew I was stepping into dangerous territory, yet I could not deny the way he made me feel seen, wanted, understood. That night, lying in bed beside a husband who no longer noticed my absence, I understood with painful clarity that my heart had begun to wander, quietly but irrevocably, toward a man who was not mine. The tension had reached a point where I could no longer ignore it. Every interaction with Ryan now carried a weight, a quiet electricity that left me breathless. It started with small things, texts that lingered longer than necessary, playful banter that felt far too personal, subtle compliments that made me feel noticed in ways Michael hadn't made me feel in years. I told myself it was harmless, that I was simply grateful for his support during the storm, that my emotions were confused. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. One evening, Michael went out for a business dinner. The house was quiet, the kids already asleep, and I found myself scrolling through my phone, waiting for Ryan to respond to a question I had sent hours earlier. When his name finally lit up the screen, my heart skipped a beat. The conversation started casually, but within minutes, it turned personal, intimate even. He asked me how I was feeling, truly feeling, about everything. My marriage, my fears, my frustrations. I hesitated before answering, fingers hovering over the keyboard, knowing that every word I typed was a step into dangerous territory. I feel lost, I typed finally. I don't know if Michael even notices me anymore. I feel like I'm invisible in my own life. Ryan's reply came almost instantly. You're not invisible to me. I see you. I hear you. You deserve someone who notices everything about you. I couldn't stop reading his words over and over, each repetition sending a shiver down my spine. My rational mind screamed at me to stop, to set boundaries, to remember my vows, but my heart betrayed me, craving his attention, his understanding, the warmth of someone who actually cared. It wasn't long before our conversations started to include calls, sometimes late at night. One night, I found myself confessing things I had never told Michael, things that made me feel vulnerable and exposed. Ryan listened without judgment, offering comfort and empathy that left me strangely addicted. You're stronger than you think, he said softly. But it's okay to let someone in sometimes. You don't have to face everything alone. I didn't realize how much I was leaning on him until the night he suggested coming over not for work, but to check on me, to make sure I was okay. My pulse raced. I told myself it was purely for safety, that he was just doing his job. But when he arrived, standing on my porch in uniform, that familiar calm radiating from him, I felt something stir deep inside me. He didn't touch me, didn't invade my space, but the way he looked at me, the subtle warmth in his eyes, made it almost unbearable to stay composed. He stayed for a short while, chatting casually, but the words were secondary. It was the proximity, the presence, the feeling of being truly seen that drew me in. When he left, I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of longing and guilt. The truth was undeniable. I was already crossing emotional lines I could not uncross, and I had no intention of stopping. The following days were a blur of internal conflict. I wanted to retreat, to repair the distance between Michael and me, but I found myself distracted, my mind replaying every interaction with Ryan. I noticed details I had never paid attention to before, the tilt of his head when he smiled, the gentle way he reassured me, the way his voice could calm the most frantic storm inside me. Michael's attempts to connect felt clumsy, detached, almost robotic, and I couldn't stop comparing him to Ryan. Every comparison left me feeling hollow, unsatisfied, and more drawn to Ryan's warmth. Then came the first real temptation, a boundary I had sworn I would never cross. One rainy afternoon, the kids were at school, and I found myself alone, waiting for Ryan to arrive to discuss safety measures for the neighborhood. When he knocked, soaked from the rain, I instinctively pulled him inside, handing him a towel. Our eyes met, and for a split second, the air between us crackled with unspoken desire. I wanted to tell him how much he meant to me, how he had become my lifeline, my confidant. And from the way he looked at me, I knew he felt the same pull. Our conversation became harder to sustain in its professional tone. Every laugh, every accidental brush of his hand, every glance lingered longer than necessary. My pulse raced, and I could barely focus on the words we were exchanging. Ryan's presence was intoxicating, a magnetic force I couldn't resist, even as guilt gnawed at me. I knew that crossing the line physically, even for a moment, would shatter everything, yet the temptation was overwhelming. As he prepared to leave, I found myself walking him to the door, standing just a breath away. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and heavy with tension. "Be careful out there," I whispered, my voice betraying the storm inside me. He nodded, eyes locked on mine, and for a fleeting moment, time seemed to stop. I could feel the unspoken connection, the electricity that was no longer just emotional. The line between right and wrong blurred, and I realized with a sinking heart that I was willingly teetering on the edge of an affair that could destroy my marriage forever. That night, alone in the quiet of my bedroom, I stared at the ceiling, replaying every detail, every glance, every word. The guilt was suffocating, yet so was the longing. I knew I was no longer just emotionally invested. I was in dangerous territory, a place from which there was no simple escape. And deep down, I understood that the fire Ryan had ignited in me wasn't just about the storm or the attention. It was about a part of me that had been missing for years, a part that my marriage could no longer reach. The days that followed were unbearable. Every time Michael came home, I felt a tightening in my chest, a gnawing guilt that made it hard to speak, to smile, to function normally. I wanted to confide in him, to tell him how lost I had felt, how Ryan had become my anchor during the storm, but I couldn't. The words lodged in my throat like a stone I could not swallow. I was trapped between the life I had vowed to uphold and the feelings that consumed me entirely. Ryan continued to check in, his messages a constant lifeline. Sometimes they were brief, a simple, "Are you okay?" Other times, long and heartfelt, filled with empathy and understanding that seemed to come from a place Michael had long stopped reaching from. One evening, after an especially grueling day, I found myself sobbing uncontrollably on the couch. The kids were asleep, and the house was silent except for the distant hum of traffic. My phone buzzed. It was Ryan. "Do you want me to come over?" his message read. I hesitated, staring at the words, knowing that every moment I delayed was another step further into danger. And yet, the pull was irresistible. Yes, I wanted him to come. Not just to talk, but to be there, to see me, to remind me that someone cared. My rational mind screamed, "Stop. This is wrong," but my heart had already made its choice. When he arrived, the rain had started again, soft and insistent, tapping against the windows. He stood at the door, soaked and apologetic, but there was a warmth in his eyes that melted something deep inside me. We sat together, silent at first, the tension thick and unspoken. Then, without thinking, I reached for his hand. It was wrong, every part of it, but it felt so right in that moment. He didn't pull away. Instead, he squeezed gently, as if understanding without words the storm raging inside me. Our conversation flowed, deeper and more revealing than ever before. I told him things I had never admitted to anyone, my fears, my loneliness, the crushing weight of a marriage that no longer felt like my own. And he listened, really listened, without judgment, without interruption. His presence was a balm, a reminder of what it felt like to be seen, to be wanted, to be alive. But as the night wore on, reality crept back in. I realized that every second with him was a betrayal of the life I had built, of the vows I had taken. The weight of it crushed me, guilt and desire twisting together in an impossible knot. I knew that continuing down this path would destroy everything, and yet letting go seemed unthinkable. The next morning, Michael walked into the kitchen, smiling at me as he usually did. But the smile felt like a challenge, a reminder of the distance that had grown between us. I couldn't meet his eyes without thinking of Ryan, without feeling the undeniable pull of something I could not yet name. I wanted to run to him, to confess, to fall into his arms and finally release the tension that had built over months. But I stayed silent, hiding the truth behind polite conversation and a fragile facade. It wasn't long before Michael noticed the change in me. The late nights, the distracted conversations, the distant looks, I couldn't mask it forever. One evening, he confronted me, his voice calm but edged with hurt. "Is there something you're not telling me?" he asked. I froze. Every instinct screamed to tell him the truth, to confess everything, but the fear of losing him, the shame, held me back. I shook my head, forcing a smile. "I'm just stressed," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Michael didn't press further, but the tension between us thickened. Every glance, every interaction became loaded with suspicion and unspoken questions. And all the while, Ryan's presence loomed over me like a storm I could not escape. I knew that I was walking a dangerous line, that one misstep could shatter my marriage, my family, my life. Then came the breaking point. Ryan suggested we meet in person, outside the house, away from prying eyes. I hesitated, torn between desire and reason, but ultimately agreed. That meeting would change everything. When I saw him, standing there with that familiar, reassuring smile, I felt my resolve crumble. We talked, laughed, shared secrets, and for a moment, I forgot everything else, Michael, my guilt, the life I was supposed to protect. As the sun set, painting the sky in deep oranges and reds, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. I had fallen for him, not just the support, not just the attention, but the person he was, the way he made me feel alive again. And in that realization, the enormity of my choices hit me like a tidal wave. I was no longer just a wife struggling in her marriage. I was a woman on the brink of destruction, with emotions and desires that could not be contained. When I returned home that night, the weight of my actions pressed down harder than ever. I knew a confrontation was inevitable, that Michael would eventually sense the emotional distance, the change in me. I also knew that the path ahead was uncertain, filled with choices that would alter my life forever. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart racing, mind swirling, knowing that the days of pretending, of holding everything inside, were coming to an end. The storm I had tried to survive alone had found a new form, a new person, and I was powerless to resist it. My marriage teetered on the edge, and my heart, against all reason, was already halfway gone. And deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again.